Good evening and welcome. My name is Lee Poston. I'm the communications advisor for WWF Greater Mekong and an FCCT board member. And this is my first time moderating a panel, so please be kind and gentle. So I wanted to start by giving some, can you guys hear okay? It's okay? Yeah. I wanted to give some upcoming events. Friday, June 14th, 2 p.m., there will be a press briefing, State of Myanmar, with two activists who will discuss their campaigns to raise awareness on issues such as non-discrimination against Rohingyas and Muslims in Myanmar, the need to end the civil war, and to amend archaic laws. This is free, open to the public, and that's Friday, June 14th at 2 p.m. Also on the same day, at 6:30 p.m., there will be a film screening of a film called Jewelry, The Seed, and a Q&A with the writer, director, and lead actress of the film, Ranji Basumatri. The film tells the stories of families as they disintegrate because of an insurgency in the northeast Indian state of Assam. This is also free for FCCT members, and 300 baht for non-members. Is that right? June 17th, documentary Gateless about child abuse in a Buddhist monastery in Cambodia, and a Q&A with director Lorraine Ma. Members are free, non-members are 150 baht, and that's June 17th. June 18th from 3 to 5 p.m., Greenpeace Southeast Asia and Ecological Alert and Recovery Thailand will hold a press conference to call for the ASEAN to discuss the issue of plastics and electronic scraps that are being dumped on Southeast Asian countries. Also on the 18th, from 6 to 10 p.m., 6 to 10 p.m., we have a press conference on the ASEAN We Want, testimony from local communities on ecologically disastrous development. This is free. And then on Friday, the June 28th, from 6:30 to 10, there will be a chance for us to celebrate the life of Ron Corbin, longtime Bangkok resident, journalist, and FCCT member who recently passed away in Australia. All are welcome to join, and of course, that is free. June 28th, from 9:30 a.m. to 11:45 a.m., there'll be a launch of a research study on Cambodian migrants in Thailand by the International Organization for Migration. Entry is free, and snacks and refreshments will be provided. So a couple of other things before we start. Many of you recently attended the Brian Eiler book launch about this book, Last Days of the Mighty Mekong. Brian would have loved to have been here for this event, but he couldn't. I think he's in Cambodia right now. But there are books available for 700 baht in the back. So it's a fantastic book, so if you get a chance, please do read it. And also, many of you probably noticed the photographs that were running on the screen before we started. They were recently on display here at the club. It's from a project by Thomas Christopherletti and Nick Axelrod of Ruom Collective. It's about the Mekong River. If you want to see more of them, go to ruom.net and look for Mekong, a River in Chains. So we appreciate them letting us use their photographs again. So, on to tonight's main event. Yep. So rivers, dams, sand mining, renewable energy, they're all interlinked, along with a host of other issues. But at the heart of it is the idea that globally we're rapidly losing our free-flowing rivers, and that's got drastic consequences for all of us. That's all I'm going to say on the issue because we have people who are much more expert at it than me. We have a fantastic panel tonight. We have Mark Guichot. Mark Guichot from WWF, Greater Mekong. He's our lead for water, and he spent decades in the region working on water stewardship, hydropower, disaster risk reduction, climate change. Then we have Leonie Pearson, Senior Research Fellow Water for Stockholm Environment Institute. She's a renowned ecological economist and an expert in sustainable development, landscape water management, livelihood policy, and urban-rural integrated assessments. Then we have Carl Middleton. Carl is director of the Center for Social Development Studies and deputy director of the Graduate Research in International Development Studies program in the Faculty of Political Science at Chulalongkorn University. His research focuses on the politics and policy of the environment in Southeast Asia, with a particular focus on the political ecology of water and energy. And then we have Reena Chandran. Reena is land and property rights correspondent at Thomson Reuters Foundation. Reena is a former business journalist who has worked in India, Singapore, New York, and Thailand with Reuters News, Bloomberg, and the Financial Times. Now, before we go to the panelists, we wanted to show you, we have a little treat here we haven't shown publicly. It's available on the website, but I wanted to show a short 2.5-minute film that will hopefully help set the scene for tonight's discussion. I hope many of you have seen the incredible Netflix series Our Planet, narrated by Sir David Attenborough. The series was produced by Silverback Films in partnership with WWF and Netflix. Episode 7 is focused on freshwater issues, and it features a lot of information and incredible footage about the Mekong and the Tonle Sap. In addition to the 8 episodes, there are numerous online short films that delve deeper into the conservation and environmental issues that are raised in the series. You can find them all at ourplanet.com. One of these short films is called How to Save the Mekong, and we worked closely with the filmmakers to put this together. This was the same filmmakers who did the Our Planet series. So I wanted to show you that video right now. Sorry, this is the wrong video. Danny? It's called How to Save the Mekong. This is a great video, by the way. Also, it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. So it's at the same URL. It must have played and then moved on to the next one. There we, nope. That's not it. I'll be right back. There we go. That one. Okay. Okay, so I think I've said more than enough. I think I've said more than enough, so I will now turn it over to Mark, who's going to start us off.
Danny? Oh, that's okay. Thank you. This is a picture of the site of the Sambor Dam that was highlighted in this video. We are very concerned about this project for different reasons. The first one is that it will drown 80 kilometers of very rare riparian forest of tropical large rivers, but also the site of the largest population of the inland of the freshwater Irrawaddy dolphin. But there are other reasons we are concerned, and I will drive you through them. The Living Planet Index is the key reference document for WWF. It shows the rate of loss of species, vertebrate species abundance since 1970. And overall, we have lost 58% of our species abundance worldwide, which is alarming. But it's different in different biomes. And the marine biome, 71% of the surface of the planet, has lost 36% of its species abundance. Terrestrial biome, 38%. Freshwater is only 1% of the surface of the planet. It holds 10% of the biodiversity, and we're losing the species here much faster. So the sixth extinction is happening in our rivers much faster than any other places on the planet. But the repartition of the species is not equal. Freshwater species is not equal throughout the world, and tropical rivers have a much higher biodiversity than most places on the planet. And actually, in terms of fish species, the Mekong is probably the most diverse river in the world per unit of river or per square meter area of river basin, with at least 850 species that are described, purely freshwater species, probably more, 1,000, and they're still describing more species. So if you want to give your name to a fish, that's the place to be. Irrawaddy, many species, we're discovering more, but what is stunning is the number of endemics. The species that only occur in the Irrawaddy River is astonishing, with 193 species. Dolphins, so those two rivers, the Mekong and the Irrawaddy, are two of the three remaining habitat for the freshwater dolphin. Many other species, including, it was Turtle Day last month, and the turtles are under big threat. This counter turtle who lives in the sand in the low stretches of the Mekong, notably in Cambodia, is under a lot of threat. But this translates into fisheries in Cambodia and Myanmar, among the top 5 countries for inland fisheries productivity, alongside much larger countries, India, Bangladesh, and China. So that's not respective figures. It's total figures, so huge. But this biodiversity, despite big efforts, notably on conserving the turtles and conserving the turtles and the dolphins, are going down. The pressure is high, and the fisheries, also the catches, and the sizes of the catches are diminishing very fast. And we're trying to wonder why, because the space for development, as it is called by the Mekong River Commission, for instance, is still pretty good. And I think the problem is that water resources people think either water quality, pollution, or water quantity regulation. And a lot of the issues that we're seeing here are about movement of fish, movement of sediment, movement of nutrients. But there's no real definition to connectivity, if you want, and if there's no definition, it's very difficult to measure it. And if you cannot measure it, then you cannot regulate it, and that's a problem. So we got to address this issue, and we worked over the past 4 years on agreeing on a definition of connectivity or fragmentation. It's contrary. Traditionally, we had the concept of e-flows, which is basically looking at the longitudinal dimension of rivers and mainly water. But rivers are much more than water. Water is important to rivers, but rivers are much more than water. There's species and movement of fish, as mentioned earlier, but also exchange of materials, nutrients, sediment, and energy there. But also there's more than two dimensions, more than the longitudinal dimension and the time dimension. There's also a lateral dimension, the movement of water and other matters between the river and the floodplain. And there's also a vertical dimension, the movement of water and nutrients, for instance, through the river to the groundwater, but also to the atmosphere by up and down. So we came up with this definition and we applied it, and after 4 years of work, large team of academics and colleagues, our research culminated with a publication in Nature last month, and the definition is out there. Beyond this, we did a map of the status of free-flowing rivers in the world. We looked at the degree of fragmentation and degree of regulation, so red, orange. Highly fragmented is red. It's not good in our world. You see that there's not many blue spots. Blue spot is good. It's free-flowing. And basically, if you look at large rivers of the world, there's about 1/3 of the rivers that are still free-flowing, depending on our definition. You see some dashes of yellow. Yellow is where sediment is predominantly important to the system, and you can see that the Mekong is yellow, so it's important and an issue. So why would we look at the status of free-flowing rivers, and what are the values of free-flowing rivers? Spiritual, many communities value flowing waters much more than reservoirs. Recreational, it's particularly in the West, but I've seen this in Laos also, on the weekend in Luang Prabang, people, in Vientiane, people go to the Tat Long March, and it's not people that need to fish for survival. It's very new Toyota Hilux cars that are there, and they're grabbing and running after crabs as a recreational pastime, and I think this is going to evolve more in the future. Floodplain agriculture, a lot of the food that we eat is grown in floodplains and benefits from the rich soil that is replenished by river. Fish stock, that's the blind spot of food security. Fish in inland fisheries values are going up, and now recent FAO figures show that they're about the same value, same productivity as marine, for again 1% of the surface of the planet against 71%. We're about in the same type of figures nowadays. But in terms of suitability of food, protein, for instance, fish are kind of a non-consumptive user of the river. They are in the river, you catch them, the water is still there for other users. If you had to replace those protein with soya, with cattle, then you need land, you need water. So it's a far less efficient way of bringing protein to people, but also a far less equalitarian way of doing it. One of the reasons why it's very difficult to ascertain the inland fisheries is that most of it doesn't go from markets; it goes directly from nets to the plate. Rivers also, and they're connected to floodplains, are key for flood mitigation. A healthy river doesn't produce negative floods. As if you come for conservation, floods is a positive and a process that builds life and sustains it. I think the problem is when people get in the way or create artificial floods. So that's also a value. Biodiversity, I mentioned it in my first slide, that biodiversity in rivers is valuable in at risk. The place where I want to put more emphasis is on sediment, the subject that I've spent a lot of time studying. What you may not know about the values of rivers is that rivers create land. And a lot of the land, actually about 1/3 of the population of the planet, lives on land that was recently created by rivers. Also, if you look at climate adaptation, I think the solution to adaptation to climate may be in allowing rivers to flow freely and to get sediment flows back to the rivers. Let's look at the world from the eyes of a geomorphologist. Geomorphology is the science that looks at processes that creates landscapes, and fluvial geomorphologists see rivers in those three zones. It's like opening the hood of a river. You take the water out, and that's how it works. Basically, three zones. You have a mountainous area that creates sediment. Weathering effect and erosion is a natural process. Then you have a middle ridge, semi-confined, that really acts as a conveyor belt, a transfer zone. It just transfers the sediment from upstream and downstream. And further at the bottom of the river, the coast, you have an accumulation of sediment, creates new land that is actually very fertile. And Asian civilizations are based on rice and fish, and often has prospered just at the bottom of the river. This is nothing more than a big pile of sand and mud at the bottom of a river on a slopey continental shelf. So there's a subsidence effect, which is a natural process. You have forcing agents on the coast. The wind creates waves, the waves create longshore currents and erode, the tides affect this. So they have a kind of two processes, one that is subsidence, one that is erosion. And then you have the river that brings new sediment. It's a dynamic equilibrium and very recent land compared to most other formations on Earth, but very valuable. So now you passed 101 of geomorphology. Let's apply it. The map of the dams on the main stem of the Mekong. We have dams upstream in China that have been built. They are large reservoirs, seasonal, annual storage. They store water in the wet season and they release it in the dry season, turbine. Such projects were planned in the 70s for the lower Mekong. Not possible anymore, too many impacts, too many movement of population. So they were reinvented as runoff the river dams, which in the water resources world of two impacts, water quality, water quantity, are sold as low impact. They do have less impact on water quality than the dams up there. And they do store less water. They store for a day to a week. It's debatable. They're still large reservoirs, 60 to 80 kilometers for most of them, and they still drown habitats. But let's agree that they have less impact, and then go back to our geomorphology screening. This basically building walls on the transfer zone and cutting the sediment supply. Let's go now to another interesting impact, the impact of sand mining. Sand mining is the largest natural resources extracted by volume on the planet after water. We extract more sand than we extract any other ore, than we extract fossil fuel or biomass. And it's also the one that is growing the most. Most of the sand ends up coming from rivers. There's sand in desert, but the desert sand is very fine, so you cannot build with it. It doesn't have the property that you can make concrete with. in seas, you have stocks of sand, but it's technically difficult to extract. You cannot really get it on the beaches. People protect beaches, and it's salted. So that's a problem. So in the end, most of the sand ends up coming from rivers because the river sand is angular, and the river acts a bit like a supermarket because of different velocities. It deposits different grain size in different places, and in the dry season, either they are just sitting there on the bank, either they're pretty shallow. So you can extract, the demand is very near. So most of the sand ends up coming from rivers. But there were no real figures, and we were traveling and doing our assessments up and down the riverbed of the Mekong and seeing all of this extraction happening. And as there was no figure, we put up a simple method based on questionnaires, and we came up with the first figure on the extraction of sand in the Mekong riverbed. And we kept, that was 2012, and we came up with 50 million tons. So you have to understand the river produces between 20 and 30. So it's far more than the river produces. This is a very conservative figure. Actually, we had 7 million tons for Vietnam, about 22 million tons for Cambodia. Another assessment by the Southern Institute for Water Resources Research, which is probably one of the most capable research institutes in Vietnam, came with a figure of 18 when we had 7, just to give you an idea of order of magnitude. And anyhow, if we do extract more sand than the river produces every year, by definition, it is not sustainable. Going back to our later screen, then it's basically that we're cleaning this conveyor belt and it doesn't deliver anything anymore to the river. So the response is pretty rapid. This is a picture, 2 pictures taken in the province of Chà Vinh. This road used to come across there and drive to the next village. It has eroded. This was the site of a village that had to relocate. The Mekong has benefited from a healthy sediment load for the past 16,000 years, actually more than that. And 3,000 years ago, the course was about this. So the entire provinces, the entire province of Cà Mau and Chà Vinh, for instance, were built by the river over 3,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, the delta didn't exist. Actually, 6,000 years ago, Phnom Penh was on the coast, and 20,000 years ago, the Tonle Sap was a sea bay. All this was filled with sediment. The rates in the past 3,000 years were about 16 to 26 meters. So I mean, the Mekong was gaining on the sea that amount of land regularly. We're now in a situation that has reversed in the past 20 years. We're not losing at least 12 meters as an average. Some places, many more. We're losing the equivalent of 1.5 football field to the river as an average every day. That's pretty easy to measure. It's a bit complex in some extent because there's still sediment coming in and there's erosion there. But if you do understand the basic processes and look at it at this scale, you can see that there's a big change. What happened also is that the extraction of sand has led to a loss of bathymetric level of the river bed. And those 2 main channels have lost elevation of 1.4 meters between 1998 and 2008. So it's 1.4 meters lower, means more salt coming in, but also the stabilization of the banks. In 2017, 2 entire provinces in Vietnam declared a state of emergency with houses falling into the water. Last week, again, 8 houses more were lost. So we did publish also, and the figures are pretty clear, and they match very much the extraction figures, and the volume lost are in the same order of magnitude. What is a bit more difficult to measure, but now we have more figures now, is the subsidence. This entire area is subsiding, and that's very difficult to measure. It's the area of equivalent area to Netherlands that is all going down at the same time. And a couple of recent figures, reports in the past 3 months, so 2019, show that the average rate is 1 to 1.5 centimeters a year. So basically, the Mekong Delta is sinking much faster than sea level rise. They're sinking 3 to 4 times faster than sea level rise. Actually, some places like Saigon has lost about 5 centimeters in the past decade, 50 centimeters loss, sinking very fast, much faster than sea level rise. The Mekong, third largest delta on the planet, is reacting very quickly to those changes. We anticipate them. They're happening faster than we anticipated. We are seen as catastrophist. It's happening much faster. The government of Vietnam is concerned. They have a resolution from the Prime Minister to address it. Part of the reason is the Mekong has very specific morphological features. In lots of its course, the substratum is very close to the surface. The bedrock is close to the surface. So it means it doesn't store much sediment, meaning that the extraction is not buffered by a big stock. So it means that's reacting very quickly. But although the processes are always the same, there's differences between rivers. And we did an assessment for the government of Myanmar and the World Bank on the sediments and geomorphology and the Irrawaddy River. We have a very different situation here. First, the Irrawaddy, a river 2,200 kilometers, so it's about half of the length of the Mekong, produces more sediment than the Mekong. The Mekong produces about 160 million tons a year in natural state. 260 million tons were produced naturally by the Irrawaddy. What happens is that very specific morphology. That's the longitudinal profile, so that's the source of the river, and that's the sea. And the slope, it's about the same level as the Mekong, 5,000 meters high. People forget that the Irrawaddy also originates on the Tibetan Plateau. Very steep first out of stretch, and then very flat. Most rivers have a much more gentle slope, very steep, and then very flat. Then you have lots of tributaries, and those color lines are the tributaries, very steep and feeding into a very flat area. So you have accumulation of sediment here naturally. What has happened on top of it, very clear and rapid in concerning deforestation rates, as much as terrestrial mining and in-channel mining that are adding even more sediment to the river. So what you end up having is an accumulation here, and the river is no slope, very wide, limited capacity to carry this sediment out. So this means river aggradation and a nightmare to navigation, a lot of drainage, dredging to be done to keep the situation. So basically the only force, the only mechanism that can get the sediment down is the floods. You have lots of rainfall here, and that's the process that has been dragging the sediment down to the delta. Well, when you have increasing floods here, and you ask a water engineer what the problem is and what the solution is, they say, well, if we build hydropower here, we not only produce electricity, but we can store floods. And we store floods, we store water, we reduce the flood issue. Well, in this situation, if you do this, you kill the only engine that is getting the sediment down the river. So the result is dams that were built in the name of flood mitigation are making things worse because more deposition and more aggradation. So that's what happens when you do not have a geomorphologist in your team. Downstream, Yangon is developing very fast, so is Mandalay. They need sand to develop. This building, like any other building, is made for 80% of sand. That's how concrete is made. So there's huge demand for sand, and at the same time there's a lot of irrigation there that stores a bit more sand. So in the end, you're extracting, and we did an assessment also, about at least 20 million tons of sand every year, probably more, and it's growing. So you have a situation that is odd, too much sediment here, it's extracted here, so you see signs already of this supposedly very well-fed delta because the river is so productive and a large delta compared to the size of the river, that shows signs of stress. What does this mean? 2008 Nargis killed 115,000 people, probably more. The capacity of the river, of the delta to cope, the natural capacity of the delta cope because of its shortage of sediment, means that you have lost resilience. If Nargis was to happen today, with the same intensity, the damage will be much, much higher. So in the end, what happens in those two cases, and in most cases, is that the deltas are deprived from sediment. And if the deltas are deprived of sediment, so reasons are dams upstream, like in Mekong, unsuitable sand mining, like in the Mekong and the Irrawaddy, this is aggravated by extraction of groundwater, deep aquifers. So there's what we call fossil water, more than 100 meters deep, 200, 300 meters deep. You pump it, it's clear. When there's sand intrusion, it's very convenient. It's not replenished. So obviously, if you take volumes out of the ground, then the ground subsides faster. So this means more salt intrusion, means water supply issue, but it also means vulnerability of increased vulnerability of the people here. Lots of the cities are built in deltas. I was looking at figures. I think if you look at the 20 largest cities on the planet, I think at least 15 are in deltas or low-lying, all sinking for the same reason. So that's, from a vulnerable perspective, resilient perspective, a key issue. It's not completely new. Most rivers in the world have seen their resilience, have seen their sediment stocks reduce, and this means deltas are receding. Most rivers are losing. There's a few exceptions, but the trend is there. But the impact will be much greater in Asian deltas because they are much greater, bigger, and because they are hosting much more population. And it's also where the growth is, and people that are really, so highest density, most vulnerable people are exposed low-lying coast, and that's where it goes. That's also where lots of the supply chains are. That's where the labor is. So that's where the business is happening. So you can put this scheme against whatever definition you may have for sustainability, and I think it is, in my view, the biggest unsustainable paradigm that we have, and it looks more like this than sustainable development. My last slide. It's not only as conservationists or geomorphologists. The WEF, the World Economic Forum, ranks every year the key risks to business, and those are the 10 top risks that they have listed this year, so it's all recent. And with the exception of cyber attack, all of this is actually to deal with those loss of resilience. And a lot is landing in the deltas. So in terms of resilience and future of business, so it is not only conservation luxury. We are really looking at development imperative to us. So back to the Sambor project, which I think is the forefront in our key concern, because it is going to be, it would be a coup de grâce to the sedimented transit to the Mekong Delta. There's lots more facts and figures on how the rationale for hydropower doesn't hold anymore in our days, while the rationale for solar is. Cambodia could have a stable grid and attractive investments with at least more than 40%, probably 42 to 46% of solar, and still meet the demand with far less risks. There's a big revolution, if one, that's how we label it, on the shift between different renewables, and we had another report that we launched in Paris last month on the side of the International Hydropower Association that makes the case also for much more solar in the grid. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. Leonie?
Thanks. So we're going to shift gears a bit here. Or maybe not. Okay, so the Stockholm Environment Institute has been working across the Mekong for the last 2 decades. Its role has been creating and sharing knowledge that will influence policy and practice. And in doing that, it's been working at a variety of different scales. This evening, I'd like to share 2 stories with you. One's at the local scale and one's at the basin-wide scale. And almost building on what Mark is talking about, I want to talk about that the Mekong is not a free-flowing river anymore, that actually it's a river that is run. So there are many intensely managed rivers around the world that are run. They are managed. They are such that the release in the upstream comes down and provides multiple benefits on the way. They flood wetlands, providing migratory bird species habitat, delivers water for irrigation farmers, it provides drinking water for urbanites, and then at the end it provides farming functions and goes out to the delta. However, for these rivers to be run effectively, you actually need to know what operational running means and what are the multiple benefits along the river. So the Mekong to date has been discussed as a free-flowing river. And Mark's graphics up there is really, I think, informative about how people still think of it as this, rural, rugged experience that we can all go out and recreate in, or we can all go out and experience in its natural form. It's almost been thinking about that if people want to experience water from the Mekong, that they need to wait for the rain or the monsoon, or they need to understand the evapotranspiration. Rarely is the Mekong discussed as a man-made operational river that requires a running plan. So today I want to share 2 stories about why it's important we start to think of the Mekong as a run river. Okay. So let's jump down to the local level. An Giang province in Vietnam. It's renowned as the place that you can find the floating rice fields. You know those amazing photos with people in boats, they've got rice, they're fishing. The livelihoods are really dependent on the fact that you've got the water interacting with your agricultural production. These rice fields are really important for the local people in that not only do they harvest the fish stock and the rice, they can export the rice or they use it for domestic production. They then also use the straw for growing other crops, so they've diversified their income. But of course, the region has undergone significant change. There's been an 80% reduction in the amount of area that's under flood rice fields from 1975 to 1994, mainly because of agricultural intensification. So this has meant that they can grow more rice in smaller areas. There's increased their income capacity, but it's also provided some environmental and health problems, including agrochemical pollution and reduced soil fertility. So the growing of rice is a really important part of the system, but it's a system that's been changing for many years. These farmers are principally interested in where and how much rice they should be planting. And traditionally, they've looked to the seasons to tell us when this happens. In 2015 and 2016, Mekong experienced the worst drought in the last 100 years. So this drought was having impacts on these local farmers to the fact that many were eating their seeds as opposed to planting them. So this is a huge change in their livelihoods, and many that had been struggling out of poverty were now going back into the poverty cycle. So as part of this drought, the Chinese government decided to provide supplemental emergency water from its cascades in the Lancang River up at the north. Now, this water was released between March and May of 2016, and it was released from the large hydropower dams that we saw on the map. This water came down, it took almost 5 days to come down the river, but for some of these farmers it meant the difference between planting a crop and keeping their livelihoods, or for that year not, and actually eating the seeds that they were going to plant. This is a really good example of how the running of the river made a huge impact, even when environmental conditions were harsh in that area. The release of dam water actually made a big impact on the livelihoods at the bottom of the delta. I sort of think maybe in the future, Vietnamese rice farmers might be looking to when they turn on the air conditioning in China as opposed to when they're looking at when the monsoon rains come. If they're looking to where the river comes and where they get their water for irrigation, they might be needing to look at different sort of indicators of river movement. So that's my first example at the local level. The second example is much more at the basin level, and I'm going to jump on to Mark's passion about sediment here. In 2017, SEI did this amazing report that looked at the sustainable sediment management in the Mekong River Basin. It's an awesome report. It's published by UNESCO. And the key finding from this report, so the big outcome, was that when you looked at all the studies that were happening over the last 30 years on the Mekong and how sediment was being moved, that the big finding was that the Mekong River does not mimic natural flows anymore. So what that means is that anyone that's looking at the Mekong River and they want to model the river, its turbidity, the amount of water, when it arrives, if you used that data as an average over the last 30 years, you'd be using the wrong data set because the river doesn't run like it did before. It's not a free-flowing river. This is a real challenge when we come to actually predicting what sort of impacts and effects some of these large infrastructure developments are going to have, because we don't have a baseline. We don't understand inherently how this river is actually moving. Of course, there are many things that are affecting the fact that this river, the Mekong, is running in a different way. There's climate change, and there's all the dams that Mark saw. I think there's another issue around dams is that whilst they're still run-of-the-river dams, there's 194 small hydropower dams that are scattered across the tributaries along the Mekong River. Now, all of these have a cumulative impact on what happens in the river movement. So the report actually identified that if all the dams were developed that are proposed, so that's the 10 across Cambodia and Laos, as well as the ones up in China, that we'd be looking at a 93% reduction in the amount of sediment that makes it to the bottom of the river. That's huge. It's enormous. Going back to Mark's Geomorphology 101, we'd be seeing a lot more declining space, and we'd be looking at a lot less access to those resources. Not only, though, is sediment important, but it's also the nutrients that are transported as well. So the key growing nutrients of phosphorus and nitrogen would also be reduced by up to 62%. This means that your productivity in livelihoods is also going to be enormously reduced, unless, of course, it's compensated for in other things, like fertilisers. So the key outcome from the study that was done for UNESCO was basically that we're looking at a significant reduction in the sediment, but also in the nutrients, and that the Mekong River does not run as a free-flowing river. So, I'm much shorter than Mark as well. So, I think the question about the Mekong should be framed around who should run the river and for whom, as opposed to talking about if the Mekong River is a free-flowing river. I think it's a really great opportunity for all of us around the room to think about how can we better understand the present realities of the Mekong rather than the myths about how it's operating. And in understanding those present realities, we can talk about what are the real solutions that need to be focused on building not only the infrastructure that's going to be coming in place, but importantly how we can support the many users of the river, particularly the local fishers and farmers that are along the river, as well as the many interest groups from the local, national and transboundary scales. Thank you.
So, Carl.
We seem to have... It would be nice to give the impression we actually planned this, because I'm going to try and answer Leonie's question with the next. But so we're going to pretend that actually it's a very coordinated panel. Actually, originally I had in the title Prospects for Transboundary Cooperation on the Lancang Mekong River, Whom Governs? So I took it out because I was Okay, so I'm going to... This kind of follows on quite nicely. So... I mean, transboundary water issues are often in the news, I think reported by many of the people in this room. To give a couple of examples, the ZPNZ Nam Noi dam disaster in Laos in July 2018. So a dam break occurred before a project was complete. At least 40 people were killed. 98 at least more are missing, and over 6,600 people displaced. A year later, or just under a year later, there's a growing disagreement between the Lao government and the project developers, many of whom are investors coming from outside the country, about what the source of why it actually happened. And there seems to be growing evidence that, in fact, it was problems around the foundation. It was not exceptional water. It was actually more related to dam design. This seems to be some of the emerging research coming from an independent panel formed by the Lao government. This example, there's many examples that we could take, but this raises a key question of who will take responsibility, including financial responsibility, for the types of impacts that have occurred, and both across borders and within countries. Maybe one of the ways to find out an answer to this is to come to the panel in a few days' time, right? Second example, the Pak Lai Dam proposed for the Mekong River's mainstream. So this is the fourth project that's been proposed, two of which are already under construction, Zaiburi and Donsahong, and a third called Pak Beng, which was put forward to be proposed for the Mekong River Commission process. So this project controversy broke out in a regional consultation when it was revealed that a large proportion of the project's impact assessment document seemed to be copied from an earlier report from the Pak Beng. A number of civil society groups across the region also boycotted the regional consultation event, saying that lessons had not been learned from previous consultations. So, I mean, these are very big stories to discuss as well, but the key question here, I think, relates to the quality of studies that are being undertaken and the accountability of decision-making processes around them. Then, finally, these bottom two pictures. So there were two leadership summits last year that basically both acknowledged the importance of cooperating around the Mekong River. First was the third Mekong River Commission Summit held in Siem Reap in Cambodia, which marked 23 years of the Mekong Agreement that mandates the Mekong River Commission. The second was the second Lanchang Mekong Cooperation Leaders Summit, also in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, that was 2 years after the first summit that was held in Sanya in China. The key questions that these summits raise are, I mean, these two institutions have somewhat similar mandates. They're similar and different. Somewhat they're synergistic, somewhat they're overlapping. But the fundamental question here is, by what principles will the future transboundary water cooperation be anchored in for the cooperation around the Lanchang Mekong River? And important to your question, with whom will be involved in that process? And it's this question that I want to address in this short presentation. So I think this has already been very well demonstrated. When I think of the Mekong, I see it's transforming from a watershed to a powershed, where hydropower dams are increasingly changing the way that the river flows, alongside other uses as well. So since this diagram shows time is on the bottom, the number of megawatts of built projects are on the y-axis, and it shows the rapid rate of hydropower construction since the early 1990s. These are the projects that are already under construction. It doesn't include the planned ones. So there are, I mean, different numbers, but medium to large dams, there are at least 60 medium to large dams in operation, and at least another 20 under construction. This includes the 6 up in China, 2 on the Mekong River's mainstream, downstream, and others that are planned. I think it's already well established by the panel that these projects have extensively changed the river's hydrology and therefore ecology and therefore impacts on people as well. Just 2 measures. So as of 2008, the total dam storage capacity across the whole Lanchang Mekong basin was less than 2%. But some researchers estimate by 2030 it could be as high as 20%. So a lot of this water is redistributed from the rainy season to the dry season. It was mentioned about the Lanchang dams, so the ones upstream. According to China's Ministry of Water Resources, the Lanchang Dam cascade reduces rainy season flow by about 30% and can increase dry season flow by 70%. So this is a significant change in the characteristics of the river. And I think, as Leonie has pointed out, this dam construction creates both benefits and harms. It depends on who you are. So if you're a farmer that depends on irrigation, maybe you get some benefits. If you're somebody that depends upon wild capture fisheries, then obviously the impacts are negative to you. If you're a fish, mostly the impacts, well, entirely negative, basically. So we actually need to think about many different life forms, not just humans. Sediments have already been mentioned. So there's many different dimensions that I'm not going to go into. I want to focus more on the governance in this presentation. So I think, so it was mentioned I'm in the Faculty of Political Science and therefore interested about public policy and what are the policies that, what are the ethics, what are the principles that underpin policies that govern things. So Leonie mentioned the recent example of what's been also called hydrodiplomacy. So actually, this also signals the significant ability to control water. So this, again, can be used for good reasons or not such good reasons. I think it's quite insightful to say maybe downstream farmers need to look at air conditioner use in China, because I think quite significant is there's not really a clear rules-based regime about how water should be shared between the upper Chinese stretch of the river and downstream. So yes, let's look more at the electricity planning. But what we need to move more towards is a proper rules-based governing regime between upstream and downstream. So this water release occurred 1 week before the first summit for the Lanchang-Mekong cooperation and was portrayed as an act of hydrodiplomacy. I think actually originally on the request of Vietnam. So there were some that benefited, as has been mentioned, but also others. This was a Bangkok Post article, Drowning in Generosity. The lack of forewarning about water coming downstream also took a lot of riverside people unawares. So what can we learn from this? It shows that at a minimum there needs to be greater coordination from the transnational level down to the local level at the way that waters are being governed. But also very important, we shouldn't be ahistorical about this. We need to remember that projects like these went ahead essentially unilaterally. So when we talk about governing going forward, we also need to think about harms going backwards as well, because this is also a basis of ethical principles of having good policy. So we need to think about the harms that were created through construction and operation, and then look forward in the current circumstances. So now moving towards the evolving institutional arrangements that are governing transboundary water. It's now just over 3 years since the first Lanchang-Mekong Cooperation Leaders Summit was held in Sanya City in China. And then the second Leaders Summit was held in Phnom Penh just under 2 years later. And it reveals the very swift pace and ambition of this Lanchang-Mekong cooperation, as has been detailed in a 5-year plan that was endorsed together with the Phnom Penh Declaration at the summit in Cambodia. So there have been, I think what's interesting is that, I mean, even the namesake, Lanchang-Mekong Cooperation, would imply a central role for the river. And there have been many important declarations that essentially emphasize the importance of the Lanchang-Mekong as a basis for cooperation between upstream and downstream, but not just around water, also around economy. So the types of activities include policy dialogues around water, improved water quality monitoring, technical cooperation, joint research, capacity building. These are all proposals about how there could be improved cooperation around water. I think also significant for this new Lanchang-Mekong cooperation is that it's become increasingly institutionalized, including a Lanchang-Mekong Water Resources Cooperation Center in March 2017, and then an Environmental Cooperation Center in November 2017. One thing that I also found interesting was that the rapid pace of scientific knowledge production that's coming through this new initiative. So at a forum in Yangon in December 2018, researchers from Yunnan University presented modeling of the entire river basin together with different potential scenarios for development. In the past, this was mainly the work that the MRC did. So in other words, the locus of planning is potentially shifting between institutions. So whilst there's been much activity to date, essentially this has been focused upon intergovernmental cooperation, and it largely lacks transparency, with little space for civil society and the communities along the river to share their own knowledge and concerns. Also at present, it's important to recognize that this initiative is more based around projects than meetings, rather than talking about a comprehensive, basin-wide, rules-based regime. I think the MRC many will be familiar with already. So established in 1995 with a far longer history between the governments of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand, created as a high-level principle to strengthen water governance. China is involved, but maintains a dialogue partner status rather than being a full signatory to the agreement. Some of the strengths of the MRC include that it has a large knowledge base, Some of its important recent studies include a strategic environmental assessment and a broader council study that looks at many different scenarios for the river basin for the future, as well as a current status assessment. And then the MRC also produces basin development plans every 5 years or so. But the MRC also has its challenges, I think has been discussed in this room many times, including its ability to facilitate meaningful dialogue around controversial issues, including the mainstream dams, as well as the ability to both promote and enforce the spirit and letter of the Mekong Agreement. And then also, I think, a very important fundamental challenge is the ability of the MRC to project the importance of the multiple values of rivers into higher level regional economic planning. It also has challenges now as to what will be its new role in relation to the Lancang-Mekong Cooperation Framework. And in this sense, if we look at the response of the MRC, it has sought to simultaneously legitimize its own role, whilst also demonstrate that it has cooperation with the LMC. So for example, regarding legitimacy, the MRC regularly states that it's the only organization mandated by international treaty and undertakes basin-wide planning under that mandate. And then it also gives examples of increasing cooperation with the LMC, including sharing data, especially in the wet season, less so in the dry season, meetings with each other, dialogue meetings, and undertaking some joint research. So there is some activity between the two. So all of this is framed as friendly and cooperative, but at the same time, it's also quite clear that the definition of the mandates between the two are somewhat overlapping, and so there's also potential territorial issues. And I think the big question, and also overlapping, LMC is also an intergovernmental partnership. So the governments are involved in both organizations at the same time. So a question going forward is, how will these two organizations cooperate? Under what principles? So this is to turn briefly now to international law on transboundary rivers. The UN Watercourses Convention is the basic international law on sharing transboundary water. It was adopted in 1997 and came into force in August 2014 when Vietnam became the 35th country to ratify it. Actually, also important is that the UN Watercourses Convention is essentially the core of the 1995 Mekong Agreement, even though it wasn't international law at the time. At the time of the UN Watercourses Convention's adoption, 3 countries voted against it, including China, largely analyzing that it gave too much privilege to downstream countries in terms of a say of the river. But then 20 years forward, an interesting paper was published by an academic from Tsinghua University titled Rivers and Reciprocity, Perceptions and Policy on International Watercourses. So this paper concludes that the UN Watercourses Convention did not consider how downstream development can have an impact on upstream development. How could that happen? Well, the main reason is that when downstream countries develop their water resources first, they can make a claim on upstream countries not to develop water resources because they're already using the water. That's the basis. So in other words, the argument of this paper is that the UN Watercourses Convention needs to be looked at again to see how downstream countries should have a responsibility towards upstream countries, not just upstream to downstream. Significant to this paper is that the lead author is also the Secretary General of the Lancang-Mekong Water Resources Cooperation Center. So the research also bridges into a policy domain. So from my perspective, this is important because it offers the potential entry point to have a new discussion about the relationship between upstream and downstream. And given the lack of substantive intergovernmental dialogue to date, this is potentially an important shift. So we have to ask the question, how does the idea of reciprocity work? Could it be an entry point to serious negotiations that could move towards a rules-based regime for the entire river basin? So I want to make 4 concluding observations about how reciprocity might inform such a debate. First is, I think for reciprocity to gain policy traction, it must be proven relevant to the downstream countries. So in my own analysis, I think that there's little evidence that the downstream governments politically have tried to challenge China's upstream development. They haven't tried to limit it that much. Meanwhile, there's not that much evidence that the upstream country has modified its behavior to consider downstream countries until recently. So I think one question is how reciprocity fits into the real history of the region. Because I think it's important then also to recognize the past harms, as I mentioned before, that we need to evaluate the past harms and talk about redress as an important basis of legitimacy for the concept to move forward. The second is that the LMC to date has largely emphasized the role of government officials and experts rather than the wider civil society and other stakeholders in the basin. It's also largely emphasized economic growth and its associated infrastructure construction, despite the fact that this can be a threat to ecological sustainability. Now, it's widely recognized amongst practitioners and researchers that water governance has to happen at different levels. It can't just be transnational, it can't just be local, it's across different levels. But also important is to recognize that everybody is a part of the puzzle. It can't just be government-led, it can't just be community. So really, reciprocity has to be talking about inclusive reciprocity that includes researchers, state, civil society, businesses, community members, all together discussing this issue. Third, I think, is to encourage diverse knowledge. So much of the knowledge that's being used so far is expert-driven, and experts have a role to play for sure. But at the same time, there's many different ways of revealing the value of the river and also how the river should be governed. So at one level, researchers and experts and governments can exchange more knowledge between upstream and downstream, and that could build some trust and have a basis for discussion. But I think expert knowledge is not enough. It also needs to include riverside knowledge, civil society knowledge, because only through including all of those different types of knowledge can we see the diverse economic, social, and cultural values of the river. And then fourth and finally, and I saw some of you were smiling at me thinking about fish, but I was actually quite serious about all of this. The concept of reciprocity needs to be extended to the reciprocal relationship between people and nature. Mark has already highlighted that, I mean, it's often said the sixth extinction, but the sixth extinction is already happening in the rivers. We need to take this far more seriously, and not just from a human perspective. So at the moment, many of the plans and the ways that the rivers are viewed is basically the river is an economic resource, and therefore it sustains, for an instrumental reason, economic values. I think amongst a growing number of people, there's a growing recognition of the intrinsic value of nature, meaning that nature separate from people's own giving it value. And therefore, my final proposal is that there should be ecological reciprocity between people and nature, recognizing the value of healthy river ecosystems, but also the interests of human and other non-human life. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Carl. And I don't know about you, but I've added geomorphology and hydrodiplomacy to my LinkedIn profile as we were speaking here, so thank you for that. So we're going to now turn it over to Rena.
Thank you. As the only non-expert here, I do not have a brilliant presentation with charts and graphs. And thank you, Carl, for acknowledging that, expert knowledge alone is not enough. So that justifies my place here. So I have a bunch of pictures, and I'm going to tell you some stories about our reporting around these issues. This is from our investigation into sand mining in India last year. You've already heard about the evils of sand mining. I'm not going to go into it. What we discovered is that even the people who are doing the mining are at risk. Men are literally dying mining sand in India. And because most of it is illegal, they have no protections whatsoever. These stories are not reported because it's illegal. It's done in the dark. It's done in remote areas. And even activists and reporters who try to tell these stories, who try to get the word out, are at risk from the sand mafias. They are threatened, they are harassed, they are arrested, they are killed. Dams. We've heard a lot about dams. And I always think that when you tell a story about a dam, what you need is a picture of the people who are affected by it. I mean, sure, a dam is an engineering marvel. This is a picture of people who were relocated for a dam in Sulawesi in Indonesia. And then what happened was that dam burst. So even after people have been relocated, uprooted from their lands and homes and their farms, they're not safe, because this can happen. So this dam burst was in January. So these are the people who survived. There were about 30 people who were killed, 30 or 60. No one really knows. Similar to the Laos dam burst from last year, no one really knows how many people were really killed. I mean, estimates range from like 30 to 70. It's all clouded in secrecy. Just today, I learned that a dam burst in China in 1975 in Henan province killed anywhere between 170,000 and 230,000 people. Very few people even know about this story. It was the first time that I was hearing about it. This is slightly off topic, sorry, Lee. But special economic zones are another major infrastructure push in the region. And many of them are on coastal areas. Many of them try and earn brownie points by claiming renewable energy projects. But they're doing the exact same thing. They're uprooting people, damaging lives and livelihoods. Don't be misled by these happy children. Their parents are not happy. They've been relocated from Yangon, from the outskirts of Yangon. These homes that you see, they're literally in the middle of nowhere. There's no access to public transport, to schools, to hospitals. And what they also lose is the space for their little vegetable gardens, which sustains them. These are communities that live on the Tonle Sap in Cambodia. These are ethnic Vietnamese, so they are stateless. They live on houseboats on the river. While I was interviewing these people, I was so afraid of that little kid. I thought he was going to tip over into the water, but he was so stable. But these people are at danger of being moved from the water, because clearly the Cambodian government has plans for the water which does not include them. They want to they want to open it up for recreation, they want to open it up for industrial projects, none of which includes these people who have spent their lives on the water and have nowhere to go, really, because Vietnam doesn't recognize them. Cambodia does not recognize them. I do want to end on an upbeat note. I don't want to push you all into drink and despair. These young women are in a little village in Sumatra, Riau province in Indonesia. They all go to university. And what they've been able to do, their village, because of a policy announcement from the Indonesian government, which is recognizing customary forest rights in the country. So they have been able, because of their village leader, the involvement of an NGO, and activism, they've been able to map their land and claim rights over their customary forest. And these women are part of sort of a women's gardening effort. So they want to do organic produce, they want to do ecotourism, and it's a way for them to keep out the mining and palm oil plantation interests as well, because that's happening in the rest of Indonesia, and they've seen it, and they don't want that to happen to their village. So here you go. This is what we're aiming for. You have community involvement, NGOs, your activism, media has a role in it too, experts have a role in it too, but what we want is happy faces, because these are the communities that are affected by everything that's going on in the name of public good. But we have to stop and ask, whose good is this for? Is it for lighting up a few malls in Bangkok or air conditioning in China? And this is a question that governments don't really ask. Very few projects, as Carl also mentioned, there are very few impact assessments done, social impact assessments, environmental impact assessments. And they're never consulted. It's their lives, it's their livelihoods, and they should have a say in these projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Rena. And thank you for bringing us the tales from your travels and from your reporting. And Thomson Reuters Foundation have been doing some really courageous reporting on these issues. And what's most important is some deep dives into these issues, really getting to the root of them. So wanted to turn to questions now, and there are microphones right there at the back. If you could please identify yourself, and if you have an affiliation, please let us know your affiliation. And if I can maybe start with something very quickly, I just wanted to get a sense of, we mentioned Sambor Dam at the very beginning, the potential for, there's a definite need for power generation in Cambodia. There's a definite need for them to earn income. But there is also another option, which is solar power, and I wonder if you would like to address the potential for solar power in certain instances in renewable projects. Maybe Mark, if you want to talk about Sambor.
Sure. There's a general rule that the further downstream of a river system the dam is, the highest impact it has. And Sambor is a great example of this, and it's the highest density route of fish on the planet, and there's more and more understanding of the negative impacts of dams and lots of delays, and so the economic case doesn't hold anymore, while the solar case is much stronger and has never been so strong. In the case of Cambodia, it's particularly, and the barriers are more institutional and artificial than anything. So there's a clear shift there that is just not happening, but that it's so obvious and that it should. Yeah.
Somebody else like to address that?
I mean, not just solar, but I think more broadly energy planning in general. Across the region, it's mainly been state-led to date, and often been understood as an incredibly technical issue. But as this panel is actually demonstrating, energy is also very central to societal decision-making. Like, the types of technologies that we choose have effects on the way that we create distributions of benefits and harms. And I think until now, because it's largely been understood as expert, it kind of excluded a lot of other voices from planning processes. But over the past 10 or 15 years, especially in Thailand, there's been a lot of civil society groups becoming more involved in the planning processes to try and bring more diverse values into it. And I mean, this is a part of the explanation that I would say that, at least in Thailand, there's more interest now in renewables, including solar. But I think the other thing is what Mark's saying, like just the changing technology. Like, some people call it like disruptive technology. That in this case, technology doesn't fall from the sky. It's brought by businesses and by people. But sometimes it really does change the rules of the game. And I think the region is kind of on the cusp of that at the moment.
Great, thank you. Okay.
Michael Mackey, freelance. A question to all the panel, which verges on heresy. If you look at this in terms of what's more conventional economic development, which means moving from being agrarian economies to industrial economies. Is this a big enough issue to be a disruptor? Leonie, you mentioned it has possible infrastructure issues. And because when you look at the great plans they have for things like the East-West corridor and the building of the southern East-West corridor, that's already difficult because all the rivers, particularly the Mekong, disrupt the connection between Phnom Penh and Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh City. You are now saying that this is going to be built where it needs to cross rivers that are much less plannable, and I'm thinking particularly of Mark's issues of how the waters, cities are sinking. So is there a possible economic disruptor going to come because we haven't planned or we haven't guarded the rivers well enough? That's my first question.
I can have an initial whilst everyone else is thinking about this. I mean, it's a huge question. Is it just like, sometimes like this modernization process seems like a juggernaut coming into the region. But I think it's actually very uneven. you see some areas of almost like hyper-modernity in Bangkok and other big cities, and other areas that are far more distant from that experience so far. I think the way that I would look at it is not necessarily, I mean, it potentially is disruptive, but maybe for unexpected reasons, that because this whole process of economic growth creates winners and losers. It's not like everybody benefits equally. So the question at the economic level is everybody benefiting enough? Or are things becoming so unequal that that becomes the disruptor because people will start challenging the unequal distribution of any benefits that come from this economic growth? So we can kind of see hints of that, I think, but also ways of controlling it.
Can I just jump in? I also think there's new ways of financing some of these big sort of investments that are potentially a way that that's going to really change how growth happens. So moving from government-owned sort of dams or government-owned and run to more boot facilities, so you build, own, operate and then transfer to other operators. I think this new financing type mechanisms might actually have some quite new players come in into the region that may not have a local vested interest as well. So that could influence how things are developed into the longer term.
Jump also 3 points. First, interesting, you're talking about the corridor. I remember talking to the ADB when they were investing 197 million. I remember the figure pretty well. We had working on the road and between Phnom Penh, Nek Luang and Ho Chi Minh City. And their logic was, we don't need an EIA because it's not going through any protected area, when it was crossing the most productive floodplain on the planet for fisheries. And so I think we've advanced a bit since. I think we need a new deal, and the problem is that decisions are then made in the hands of economists and engineers. The economists think linear growth when environment goes through thresholds, and they don't know they don't understand when building up ends up and impacts, and in the end, when you have an impact, usually you have 3 levels. You have the cause, you have the aggravating factor, and you have the symptoms. And often we address the 2 later and not the first, because we do not understand those systems and this temporization that happens because of those threshold system. And the other issue is engineers, and engineers think static. They think a road is static, it's solid, a dike is static, it's solid. Deltas are dynamic equilibriums. They're those 3 forces. And actually, this dynamism makes the resilience. A beach and its associated sand dunes are much more resilient to the aggressivity of a typhoon than a dike is. And the dike, on the contrary, it is less aggressive, but there's a issue. This goes into governance issues and money that is made on building dikes, but it doesn't make any sense. But the decision makers are still economists and engineers, and that's where we get stuck. The last point is on finance. I think we need $3.9 trillion to implement the climate adaptation strategy in the SDGs. We have 1.4. We're lacking 2.5 trillion. There's appetite from the more these green banks. They are willing to invest. The problem is there's no pipe. There's no ready-made bankable projects. And that's what we're trying to address, because that's the bottleneck. We know what sustainable infrastructure is. We have some models for more responsible investments, but that's lacking in working with the Dutch government and with UN Habitat and 4 geographies and Bangladesh and India and Indonesia on that very issue of developing much more responsible solutions that do look at not pushing the problem elsewhere. So if you build a dike, you don't solve the problem, you push it to somebody else. If you drain your village, you don't solve the problem, you push it to somebody else. So making sure that everything is internalized and that you have at minima a zero impact to the entire system, and then packaging it in a way that you can present some early investments that could be public, that de-risk and make it much more appealing to private investment, bankable water solutions that are much. So we're working on that issue, and we just actually were awarded a relatively big grant, $160 million from the Dutch government in a consortium that does exactly this, to come with some early projects and turn them into bankability, and in order to come to this 4 trillion that we need in the developing world in order to address this gap, in order, if we are serious about implementing the SDGs and the climate change agreements.
I just want to add a caveat on development finance, if I may. Simply because it's termed, simply because it's termed development finance, we assume that they must be careful about, or more careful than commercial lenders, but it's not true. Recently, the US Supreme Court agreed to hear a case against the IFC, which is a financing arm of the World Bank, on a project in India where they had funded a coal-fired power plant, which caused a lot of distress on the coast and to the communities there. And the World Bank is protected by a law that says it's beyond these lawsuits. But the US Supreme Court has said, yes, we'll hear this lawsuit against the IFC. And I think that's development finance institutions are coming increasingly under the scanner for not doing these impact assessments for the projects that they claim is for the good of the people in the countries that they're in. So that's just a caveat on development finance.
Rena, I have to say, it wasn't a particularly inspiring evening when I considered the scale of environmental destruction. But when you brought in the fact that there's a Trump, I don't say appointed, but where President Trump is appointing so many senior judicial officials, the fact that the American Supreme Court is going to look at something which your words, it didn't have the right, or the World Bank said it didn't have the right. It seems to be getting worse, and it's now a judicial dispute as well. Anyway, that's...
No, but, several countries have in the past tried to sue the World Bank for projects that they have funded. And every single time, that case never went past the district court in DC, because they would say, no, there is a law that protects the World Bank from these lawsuits, so we cannot hear these lawsuits, never mind how much merit they had. So despite my ideological differences with the composition of the US Supreme Court, I don't think they should have a law that protects them from these lawsuits. If they were wrong in not doing the assessments, then they should be held accountable. So.
Well, that's a small consolation. My other question is on the issue of sand, and here we're going to go back to law. I'm sorry. My understanding was that a lot of this sand was extracted and then exported, with quite a lot of it going to Singapore because of the degree of reclamation that Singapore does. Singapore, some years ago, set up a liability for companies, people who were ill in Singapore with respiratory infections, to sue companies that had deforested in Indonesia and were causing the haze. Is there any way that this could be allowed to go to the Singaporean courts?
I think the Act is the Transboundary Haze Act, right? I think it's specifically for haze, but what's it's a broader question of transboundary accountability, so I'm not following sand so much, but actually, in the case of that law, no one has actually been successfully prosecuted to my knowledge yet, for various reasons, and so even some of the civil society in Singapore are looking for other strategies to have transboundary accountability. But I think more broadly, and actually it will be a part of the ZPN Xenon Noi panel, I would guess, like different transboundary accountability mechanisms are trying to be developed in different ways, often using soft law rather than hard law, to keep to account different forms of cross-border trade. So I think this is an important shift in what's happening. that many problems, whether it's sand, water, investments, are not territorially bounded anymore. In the way that you described industrial modernization happening, it's not just national. So there have to be transboundary mechanisms, including things like the Mekong River Commission, that's set up for transboundary decision making.
Well, just today, hearings began in Bangkok in a case of a Thai sugar company that was sued by Cambodian farmers for human rights violations in Cambodia by the Thai firm's subsidiaries. It's the first such transboundary class action lawsuit, actually, that's been, it was accepted by the Bangkok court because the civil society organizations in Cambodia felt the court system in Cambodia may not be fair to them, and if they were to get compensation, then they would get higher compensations at a Bangkok court. So it's quite a landmark case. So hearings started today.
Right. Thank you. Next question.
Paul Risley with FCCT. Local governance of the river. What are the practical examples of international transboundary river commissions that work from anywhere in the world? And then what are the steps that we can take so that the MRC or something equivalent can do a better job? From everybody on the panel.
Who wants to go first?
I can try. Yeah, the usual reference is the Danube, which is the river with the most member countries, where the system is relatively decentralized and owned by the government. So the secretariat itself is pretty lean, and the buy-in from the countries is big. So it's not perfect, but it's usually the example that you go to, and I think the best example for the MRC. The problem with the MRC is the other way around, that you have a donor-driven big secretariat that is somehow disconnected from the line ministries, or have its pet line ministries, and that's part of the problem. The other problem, of course, is that the countries disagree on the rule of the games and the procedures, which makes it a difficulty. And then the other problem is that it is very much a water resources strictly only issue, which on paper the Langsang Mekong looks much better because it is head of state, not ministries of water resources. It is all countries, and the water and energy security is embedded, I think you mentioned this, into a larger economic frame. Because in the end, the key problem is that the water resources world is disconnected from economic planning. And most of the investments go through economic planning, disregarding all the knowledge you have in water resources. And it's partly the fault of water resources, and I'll blame myself for jargoning, and basically we agree on 95% of the issue, but we spend 90% of our time discussing the 5% we disagree on, and send inaudible messages to the economical planning, and that's part of the problem, and that's very much a problem of the MRC. So that's that's the issue. But yeah, in terms of governance, the international rivers and example, I would go to the Danube as the example.
I was going to suggest the same. Good example.
Okay, I'm going to put forward a slight defense of the MRC, that there are many things that are also good about its design, at least. I mean, but there's many things in practice that need to be strengthened, but in some ways, in the context of the Mekong Basin, it's a very challenging role with all of these dynamic forces that are happening, like the economic growth and so on. So I think we have to sort of work with what exists. I think not just looking to examples of other river basins, but also to the international law like the UN Watercourses Convention that Vietnam signed and how that can be better implemented. I think understanding how things should work in practice, but I don't know, I feel that there's a lot that we can actually exchange, not just bring something from outside and bring the expert in, but also just learning from different river basins contexts. I know on the MRC's webpage, they just visited the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia, for example, to kind of share experiences. But other, like you're saying to link local to transnational. So I mean, there's examples of community fisheries, for example, across the region that are good within their local context, but still could be strengthened. So, I mean, there's also, I say it's not a picture of everything is terrible. There are also very good practices in the region that could be learned from.
There are several examples in South Asia where the rivers are under threat as well. But it's getting increasingly hard, I think, for communities to govern their rivers because there's so much interference from states. I mean, India has this brilliant plan for river linking, a multi-billion-dollar river linking plan, which is just going to disrupt everything. Because communities that I've seen in the Kaveri Delta in South India, it's the rice bowl of India, and they've had their systems of shifting cultivation and who could take turns at fishing, and all of those systems are lost now because of damming, because of industrialization. So they're left with no independence, really. So there were systems, they worked, but there are very few such systems left now.
Okay. Jim?
Hi, Jim Pollard, FCC member. I hosted a panel like this here about 10 years ago, and at that stage we were talking about the dozen dams proposed on the midstream of the Mekong, and thinking, well, what can we do to stop them? And of course, as we all know, not a great deal, frankly, very sadly. The two big threats, it appears, to major rivers in this part of the world appear to be the Mongtong Dam up in Shan State and the Sambor Dam, which was called the Killer Dam, actually, by Brian Eiler, who was speaking here about his book just a few weeks ago. I'm just wondering, one, do you agree that those are the two of the biggest concerns that are going on right now? And two, can you do a little bit of crystal ball gazing and give us an idea whether you think those dams are going to come into being? I realise WWF and probably a lot of other groups are going to do whatever they can to try and stop this Sambor Dam and, push for solar power. I know in the case of the Mongtong Dam and just what's going on there on the Salween, the IFC, the World Bank arm, did a big basin study, and it basically said, I gather, that better if you build your dams on tributaries. Now it looks as though the Tatmadaw, the Burmese military, are looking to go ahead with major dams proposed on the Salween, such as Hat Gui and Mongton. Although Mongton, I think the IFC was saying this is a horror dam which is going to create a reservoir that could be 200 or 300 kilometres long. It should be split in two. There hasn't been a lot on that lately. Any news you have on progress of either of those two projects and how we can help stop them would be very welcome. Thank you.
Okay. I can maybe deal with the Mongton. Big news is we have a book coming out about the Salween in a few months' time, which is free as well for an academic book. So look online in about August, and maybe we can have maybe we can be invited for a panel here. In the Salween, so this is a part of a larger research project that we've been doing for almost 5 years, emphasizing plural knowledge. Academics have been involved, civil society, communities, others, to really understand the multiple values of the Salween. And the way that we tried to make sense of it was to look at the river through what we call a pathways analysis. And if you compare the Salween with the Mekong's really complex. The Salween is even more so, because if we could talk of the Mekong having the Mekong River Commission, it's because there's actual like 4 states or 6 states that govern the river in a way through the Mekong River Commission. But in the Salween, there's not the same governing arrangements because much of the territory is also contested between different political parties, ethnic armed groups, as well as the union government, as well as the very big role for the Tatmadaw that was mentioned. So I think actually we can't talk, there's a lot of uncertainty about what will happen on the Salween, not just because of project planning, but because of the peace process more broadly. I think we cannot separate thinking about dams on the Salween from understanding the dynamics of the peace process in Myanmar. I mean, unfortunately, that it seems a lot more unlikely to conclude, at least in the near term, compared to the expectation after 2010. But then the question becomes, is it even possible to go ahead with large dam projects in the absence of a political agreement and peace? And if you look at the different government positions, it kind of oscillates between we cannot go ahead until there's a peace, like either peace or political agreement, to we are going to try and do these projects anyway. So it's difficult to read the government's positions. But from my understanding, the most recent positioning of the Thai government at least was that there needed to be some form of peace because you can't build a big project. You need to have some form of security at least around the site. So many of the, in fact, I think all of the projects are in contested areas at present. So if you were to make me look into a crystal ball, I think it's pretty difficult to see these projects going ahead. But it may not be for the lack of trying by some of the project proponents.
Great. Anybody else?
Yeah. The problem is more the where than the how, and the siting is key, and most of the debate and the discussion goes on the design and the operation rules. So in other words, you have to do the right dam if you want to do the dam right, and that's where the tool or the approach I mentioned, the concept of connectivity comes handy, because you can affect a degree of regulation, degree of fragmentation to river projects, and compare siting, and doing this, you can have the same power outcome with far less impact to connectivity, which has this huge cost to fisheries and to deltas, for instance. And I think technically, it is technically, scientifically very easy to do and to ascertain, but in the end, it's a governance issue. And the problem is that the current system to allocate some concessions is the problem, because there's no incentive to find the optimal siting, because once you get concession, then there's a race to demonstrate that and to push your project through. There's absolutely no incentive to assess the fact that this site is not ideal and to get another site. There's no mechanism to do this, and I think that's probably the key problem that leads us to have projects develop on the least optimal sites, when you can do for very simple sediment frame, for instance. If you look at the 100 projects in a pipeline, most of them in Laos, if you look at the impact of the stocks of sand and how they need to get to the delta, then 17 projects would be a problem. And the others, the 88, only from sand perspective, sediment and mainly sand, would not be a problem. But those projects, those 17 projects, I think 11 or 12 are pushed back. So they're just the wrong site. And it would make much more sense to equip the least impact. It's very easy to identify the 20% most risky hydropower project, the 20% least risky, and to have some kind of policy mechanism that incentivizes and put the best investment and in terms of funding, but also in terms of knowledge into those 20% least risky sites and develop those. common sense it would have, but it's the governance framework is not allowing to do that. So we end up with projects, downstream projects, or projects and pristine rivers like the Salween, which is the second only river left that links the Tibetan Plateau to the sea, for instance, and all those values that are clear to scientists. But so yeah, the same outcome from projects and already affected places. So in optimal sites, if you want, would have far less impact. But there's no mechanism to do that.
Anybody else?
I might just throw in one more question, if I may. Last October, we hosted a project about, I think it was the launch of a book in regard to dams in Laos, the impact of the Nam Turn 2 project in Laos, and how that very, very sadly had inspired the Lao government to think that it should become the battery of Southeast Asia. Then, of course, we had this tragedy last July that you've already spoken about, the ZPNZ Nam Noi Dam down in Atapu. They're saying 40 dead. People on the panel last October said at least 800, and we've heard from other sources that could be over 1,000 dead. Obviously Laos is a closed state and a secretive society, but I'm just wondering, has anyone seen any indication that tragedy, which, I know from, I did some reports on that for Asia Times. Asia Times had a correspondent in Seoul, and he was describing the building company, I think SK, as essentially a rogue outfit that, undertaking mafia-style operations, probably of the sort that Rena knows a lot about. I'm sure they're going on in India. But anyway, I would have thought the problem they have there is there is a building company up in Seoul, which probably should never have been allowed to be involved in that dam, and they're now fighting giving proper compensation. But what I'm interested is there any sign that any of you have seen that the Laos is rethinking this idiocy that they've had in their head about becoming, the battery of Asia and having a dam on virtually every tributary?
I mean, my short answer is no, I have seen no sign.
I think maybe you'll be joining the panel in a few days' time that will also give you a more complete answer, and I know that you've been following it closely yourself, but I mean, there was a moratorium on new projects announced after the disaster, although it seems many of the projects that already had contracts were continuing all the same. One thing that did surprise me was that the Lao government commissioned this National Investigation Commission that I mentioned at the beginning. I think that's pretty interesting. It's not like a comment on the whole sector, and I don't feel able to do that. But the fact that they may be producing a study that questions the quality of the construction, if the initial reporting that is correct, if that's correct, then that seems quite significant to me, because it will then start raising questions of the accountability of the companies to the government. But I mean, this is there needs to be a lot more said that I do not know the answer to. Sorry.
The formula for disaster is the fact that hydropower projects are very complex and they require huge capacity, and those large projects, starting with Nam Turn 2, were basically all decisions are made by the developer, investor, and which is not a problem in principle because they have the capacity. The problem, again, they have no incentive because there's no checks and balance. And that's, I think, the recipe for catastrophe. That's, in my view, what explains the disasters, the Sapiens and Nam Noi, less than what material they use, or the rainfall event is pretty normal for that period in that place, and they're just the trigger of something. So the issue is then if you can cut corners, you will do it because you have this obligation. If you are a private company, you're here for profit, and despite the fact that you have the best capacity, technical capacity on the planet, that's where the decision is made in the end. So as long as you don't have this neutral government-led body that has this capacity, then when you request your developer or investor to investigate and make decisions for you, that's where the problem lies.
I'm not even going to try.
Hi, can I just ask one question? I'm a new member. I'm an engineer. I started my life on North Sea oil. I've been through coal. I've been through various other forms. And at the moment, I run a water company here in Thailand and across the Mekong in Lampabang. I also got involved in hydropower in Laos. I'm working on a project in Seng Quang. Another one down Hoi Palai, down in Pak Se. The feeling I get is that for most of us, we tend to look at the effect and not the cause. I've worked here earlier on when the big thing about dams in Thailand was water supply. They didn't build the dams out in the eastern seaboard, and now the eastern seaboard in Thailand has got a mega problem with lack of water. The Greenpeace people came. They mobilized the villagers then mobilized the government, the dams were cancelled, we have a problem. The issues over in Laos at the moment, from what I can see, because I have to deal with the ministers, I deal with the people, the engineers, the financiers, the banks. The issue is, we, all of us in the West, have produced this environment where green is the place we go. We talk about solar power, we don't talk about the impact of producing the panels, of the obnoxious materials that goes into a solar panel and the way we get rid of it. We talk about coal because it's history, and I'm from England, so I'm sorry, but we probably created more damage through coal than anybody. But nevertheless, coal still has a place. I worked on the North Sea. North Sea gas was the wonderful green new energy. It's no longer, because it's no longer fashionable. We're sitting in a room here, single glazing. This building has single glazing, as most of Bangkok. When I first came here as an engineer, I tried to persuade people to put double glazing, triple glazing into buildings. We're sitting in an environment tonight, very comfortable, talking about people in Laos and people doing this, that and the other. We are burning energy tonight, pumping out into the atmosphere. I think what happens, we need to do is go back to the cause. The cause is we're using too much energy. We're creating babies, which is a big issue, but that's a by the by. But we're creating the problem. We're trying to solve a problem. The people I deal with in Laos, most of the guys want to make money. They see the opportunity of Western people saying, green is good, hydro is green, let's do hydro. And that's what's driving the process. The government themselves are just following along behind. And that's the relationship which I see. So just to put my pennyworth in, so thank you.
Thank you. Anybody like to it? Yep.
Yeah.
Carl.
Thank you, that's really good points. On the eastern seaboard, I've also worked there a bit. And I mean, it's not just water scarcity, it's actually water allocation between different users of water. So a lot of the water shifted from the existing cassava farmers that were there into industry. So I think when we talk about shortage of something, we need to talk about who gets things. Often it's a question of redistribution. So especially with something like water, when water becomes scarce. And actually the Eastern Seaboard project's an interesting example because now it's expanded to become the Eastern Economic Corridor. The plan is to import water from Cambodia to address the new shortages. But I think the point about, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, I was going back, I'm a bit older than you, by the way. Going back 10, 15 years, when we were talking about just natural water, the people talk about the industry. The industry requirement is relatively small compared to the population that's out in the eastern seaboard. So I don't disagree with what you're saying. I think that's obviously exacerbated the problem. But going back before that, we have this, I was trying to make the point where we tend to launch into a problem as Westerners, thinking we know what we're doing. When it's solved, we all kind of disappear and leave the poor guys behind with the problem. So that was the point I was making. You're quite right. The industry has, in fact, made it 10 times worse, if not more. Yeah.
Yeah, and polluted it as well. Yeah. But then going to the question of energy, one thing about energy is that it's too cheap. Actually, the cost of the amount that is paid for hydroelectricity importing from Laos to Thailand basically doesn't cover enough in terms of the environmental and social harms that it creates. So I think in terms of even if we think through market mechanisms, an incentive to bring double glazing here would be if the cost of cooling the building down became significantly more expensive. So I think that cheap electricity is actually an issue on the one hand. But on the other hand, the way that the economies are run in the region are based upon cheap labor and cheap resources, and that's the competitive edge that the region tries to maintain in order to export goods and make money. So the challenge is, how do you raise the price of energy and make it persuasive at the same time?
Good point. So there was a lot in that comment, but I think part of the problem is that we have to make complex decisions, and it's about comparing apples and pears often. And the problem is that some things are easy to measure, like cubic meters of water or kilowatt hours. Others are much more difficult, like a lot of the externalities of hydropower, for instance. And that, I think, biases a bit some of the decisions.
Anybody else? Okay. If there are no further questions, I want to thank our panelists for a great discussion. And thank you all for great questions, and I think it really drives home the complexity of a simple molecule like H2O. This is a really complex issue, and read Brian's book. It's for sale back in the back. So thank you all.